Okay. So we've had one day to explore some very simple sort of setup for React, how to get something showing on the page. There were some requirements for the to-do list, which you probably were trying to figure out how to implement yesterday afternoon. So this morning's session will help give you some tools to do this. And the way that we're going to think about this is thinking about how we keep state in a component. What is state? So state, we've talked a little bit about state over the past few weeks. State is just simply holding values somewhere in your program. Anytime you store a value in a variable, you are keeping state of some kind. So we're going to think about the two different ways we can create components. Now, we have two objectives for the session. We need to be able to explain the difference between a stateful and a stateless component. All right, so keep this objective in your mind for this morning's work. And then we want to be able to actually use them to build a very simple app that uses the two different kinds of components. I'm going to demonstrate using two of them, and then you're going to do the same thing, well, not the same thing, but you're going to use the two different kinds of components with a different set of requirements. So these are your requirements. I'm not going to do these requirements. I'll do a different set. This is what you're going to be doing later this morning, thinking about how you do this, implementing two different kinds of components. So this is the scope of this morning's session. If at any point you want me to close the window, please let me know. I know there's a little bit of outside noise, traffic and whatnot. If it gets too unbearable, let me know. But I'll make a judgment call over whether I want the window open for temperature reasons or whether you need it for auditory reasons. Anyway. Okay, so learning objectives. This is today's workshop, so forth and so on. So let's have a quick chat on the Miro board. I want to quickly give you a description of what I'm going to do and how I'm thinking about it. Then I'm going to implement it. I am not going to be writing any tests this morning, and this morning you don't need to write any tests. So today is a test-free, or this morning is a test-free morning. I don't usually say that, so enjoy it while it lasts. Thumbs up from Ryan. But the focus today is not about writing tests, it's just thinking about components, all right? Okay, so what I want to do is have a simple page that has a button, and I'm going to have it show, I want to essentially click on a button and I'm going to randomize a bunch of numbers. I'm going to simulate some kind of dice roll, all right, every time I click on this button. So I click on this button, let's call it roll. And I'm going to see 1, 3, 4, for example, pop up on my page. I do it again, and I might see another set of random numbers. 4, 1, and 4. Clearly I like the numbers 1 and 4 this morning. This is what I want to do. All right, quite simple, quite straightforward. There's a few things in here that we need to know how to do though. One is, how do I store the numbers? 2, how do I trigger behavior off the click event? We've seen an example of this last week, thinking about using our add event listener function to hook into that event and then trigger behavior. I'm going to see how we do it in React. So these are the two questions we're going to think about For the moment, I'm going to keep things simple. I'm going to create one component and keep everything in the component, and then we'll have a look at extracting a component and the reasons for this. So the first thing to notice is that we do need to keep some kind of state, essentially these three numbers, and then we're going to have to update them or change them every time we click on this. So anytime that something needs to change or be updated, you should think of a stateful component. And for the moment, stateful. And for the moment, the way that we're going to be thinking about it this week is to use a class component. So far, we've just been doing pure functions or function components. You might have done yesterday, but today we're going to use a class component to see how that can help us keep state. So I'm just going to design one component that has a button and a set of numbers. And every time I click on this button, I'm going to update the numbers. So this is what I'm going to do. I've answered my first question. One, how do I store numbers? Because I'm going to use a class component with the state object, and we'll talk about that as I do it. And then two, we haven't yet talked about the triggering behavior, but we'll get that. Okay. So I have an empty component here. There's a bunch of setup in this directory because this is like the app that I use for all the workshops for React. So most of it I just want you to ignore, but let's just go through what this looks like. We have in our public folder, we have an HTML file, same that you probably have been using. There's nothing in it apart from that original element that we're going to insert all of our React into. We use our index.js as like the entry point. This is how the insert happens. We take our app and then we insert it into the root element. And the app, the top level app component is this one here. It's got nothing in it apart from one div element that I've got some nested components. So currently what this looks like is the most well-designed web page you'll ever see. All right, it vies for competition with some of your thermostats. All right, so this is I'm going to just load the component below here. All right. So far, pretty much things that you've been working with so far. I've separated here all specific components into component directory with sort of specific names for the kinds of components, set of components that I'm going to be using. So this might be something that you want to also do in your React projects. Create a specific directory to hold your components and then subdirectories with areas of the page or component, a high-level component name. And I'm going to be adding things into this one. So here I've got an empty file. I've called it dice roll. And I import it on line 5. And I'm going to use it on line 16, but I haven't written anything of it just yet. So let's have a look at how we do this. So the first thing we need to do is import React. If you ever want to remember how to do it, you just need to go back to sort of the app.js and have a look, remember your uppercase and lowercase. Import React from React. But we're not just going to import React, we're also going to import components. I think I need to do it like this. I have to remember in a second, I'll look up the docs. So I'm going to import React and component, and I am going to write my class. So a class is going to be, as you might expect, we've done a lot of JavaScript classes, and we give it the class name, class, let's call it dice roll. But the difference with this class is it has to extend component. And this is where it gets all of its nice, juicy Reactness from. All right, it inherits the behavior from the React component. This comes from React. As with all classes, if we need it, we're going to set up a constructor. Now, for a class, the way that we're going to use this class is we're going to give it an argument called props. So back to this diagram, the two main ways of keeping state, your choice between using state or using properties, short for props. The main way you'll make this decision is, does the state change? All right. Clearly, in this example, I am updating it, and in which case we'll choose this. If it doesn't, we'll choose this. And we'll have a look at when I get onto using a component with just props in the second half of this demonstration. But the main way you'll answer this question, how do I store any state in my component, is if it changes, we use a state object. If it doesn't change, we use properties. All right, we'll come back to this in a second, well, in a few minutes when I get there. I'm going to have my class, because it's a class, I'm going to use a constructor function, and I'm going to tell React to set up my properties. So I use the super method. Super method is common in class hierarchies. It just goes and runs the constructor method of the parent class. So the parent class is component, and super then takes this argument and tells it to run the constructor function, the parent class's method. So the component has its own, it's hidden away in React, and it just runs the constructor function, does all the setup for us. We don't need to worry about that. But for state, I'm going to use this property and keep state like this. We call it state, and this is expected by React if you want to have a state object, and we use it like this. Every class should have, every component needs to have a render method. It needs to, a purpose of a component is to be able to describe what the user sees. So I'm going to define my render function, which returns some HTML stuff. So here I'm going to want to show the button and the numbers representing the dice roll. I need to make sure I export my dice roll. So this is a sort of very simple setup of a component, a class component, you can see here that the two main parts of it is the constructor function that takes in the properties, any properties that we use it. We're not using any for the moment, but this is how we set it up, and a state object. All right, I haven't included anything in here for the moment, but I will add to this in a second. And then we have our render function. It returns, it shouldn't be these brackets, it should be these ones. Why is that autocomplete? Go away. Okay, so let's go back to my design for a second. I want a button, and when I click on, I have these numbers. Let's just make sure we can see it on the page first. So let's create a div, create a very simple one. And within this div, let's have a heading that says something like, I am a class component, in capital letters, because clearly we need that. Okay, so I want to see this. So let's go back to my app.js. I'm going to uncomment this so we can actually use it. And let's see what errors we are getting. Does not contain dice roll. Have I loaded it from the right place? That will be an interesting question. Components, dice roll. It should be dice roll. Let's have a look. I can't see because all you're facing away. What's my console saying? It doesn't like this, and maybe I didn't write it correctly. Let's go back to my component. Maybe it's already exposed directly and I don't need to get it as a property. I'll go look at the documentation in a second if that doesn't work. Attempted import does not, I'm pretty sure it does, but let's have a look because that's an error message. Hold on, folks, while we do some live debugging. Attempted import error. I'm looking at this error message down here. Components dice roll does not contain, I think it does though, export. Thank you. Let's change one thing at a time. I write my class, I export it.
Shouldn't it say extends?
You might be onto something. Thank you, Mr. Eagle-eyed Grant. Thank you. Extends component. There we are. I was like, why is that not working? Render, return div, so we have it showing on the page. Okay, so we have our component rendering, and then we have to think about, well, I want it to show some numbers, right? So in my state object, let's initialize it with some initial state. So let's give it a property, let's call it dice. And dice is going to be the property, and the value is going to start off with an array of numbers. And let's say when we create it, let's just start off with some hard-coded numbers, right? 3 1s. How do I then display the current state? Well, rather than having this heading, what we're going to do is loop through this state, the dice property, and show all the numbers. So the way that we can do that is we can write JavaScript in this return statement by using our little curly brackets and do something like this .state dot dice. That will give us back the array, and then we're going to loop through it, and let's essentially go through it and return back each number. All right, and we'll create a like a little element for each of the representations of one die. So if I loop through it, I'll take each, also singular die, and I'm not saying I want to die. Take each die and then let's return back. Let's create a div. I can't think of anything that's a better name for this. And I want inside of this the individual die. So again, what I'm doing here is I'm just looping through this array and taking each of these numbers and then displaying it. So I see 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Maybe I'll create a span instead, so it's just all together on one line because divs are block elements. Okay. Make this a little bigger so we can see. I've got 3 numbers on my page, 1, 1, 1. So just staying here for a second, the way that we can use our state object in a React component like this is we can use a state property in our constructor. And then it's an object that has properties that we can access. So we use dice because that's what we want. You can name this anything that you want, and then you give it a value. Now, say for example, I wanted let's talk about props for a quick second. I could, in theory, no, I'll talk about this at the end. Okay, so the next step after this is we want to create our button. I want to be able to click on my button and change this array here. So let's create my button. And the way that I want to do this is to create a button element. And let's say roll. So let's have a look at what that looks like on the page. Roll. Nothing happens when I click on it, but I see it on the page. Now, in order to trigger some behavior off of it, we're going to use a property here for an attribute for the button elements. So we always add attributes within the opening tag of an element. And for this, we're going to say on click. We have to think about how we use this. So if you think back to what you've done so far, using an on-click attribute sets up in pretty much the same way the add event listener on this element. So it's a lot shorter to write. I need to go through the whole process of adding or like targeting the element and then trying to add the event listener to it. You can just use the on-click attribute. The on-click attribute here will take the function that it will run. So we have to figure out what we want to happen here. So the way that we can do this is by defining a function within our class. All right, the thing that we want to run when we click it. So beforehand, you might have done something like add event listener on the target, whatever it was, elements.add event listener with whatever the event was and the function to run. And then you added the function here as like the callback for the event listener. So rather than this approach, we know what the element is because it's the button. And we're adding specifically the click event here, so on click. And there's a few different attributes you can use for different kinds of events. On mouse over, on click, on hover, and things like that. You can look up the different attributes to use. Behind the scenes, this gets converted into something like this anyway. So this is just essentially what we call syntactic sugar on top of this. The function that I want to run is something that looks at this state and essentially changes this. Now, the important thing to know about React components when we want to change them is we don't change the state object directly when it's state over here. Instead, we have a specific function to call to change the state object. So let's say, for example, I want to write a roll method. We'll write it like this to begin with, but we'll change it in a second. And say, for example, this is the function I want to happen when I click on my button. I want to change the state object, specifically the dice property. So this is what it does, all right? And then once I change it, I want to render, re-render the component. So I click on this button. I want to update this object, and then I want to then display my dice again. Those are the things that have to happen. So the way that we're going to do this is we have to call this function, set state. This comes from React. And we have available, this is available to us because we've extended the React component. So we never change it directly. You might be tempted to do something like this and then change it. But always, rather than directly modify, we only set it at the beginning, and then in order to change anything, we call set state, like this. All right, we pass an argument. We pass an argument, which is the object, the state object. So in this case, it doesn't have to be the whole thing. It will just be the property value, that pair that we want, or pairs that we want. So I want to change the dice to be, and let's hard code it for now, and then we'll think about how to get it random. 2, 3, 4. So when this roll function executes, I'm going to set state. I want to update my state of my component to have a new dice property value pair. And when I call set state, it does the update, and then it automatically re-renders. So this is all I need to do for the moment to update and re-render. Set state causes a re-render, which is quite useful. So set state, update state, and then re-renders. In order to call this function, the roll, I'm going to call this dot roll. I'm going to pass it that function. I think I probably need to do it like that instead because it's React. I think that's the way. I might use some quotation marks. We'll have a look in a second. We'll have a look at the error messages. What I'm trying to do is pass this function to my onClick handler. All right. So there's going to be one small caveat to this, which is the way that I've written this function and the description of what this is. But we will see that error come up. So far, what I want to focus on for the moment is making sure we understand the process behind this. All right, I create my initial state using the state object, and if I want to change it, I have to call set state. All right, don't access this directly. The other part to this is I have my button element, and in order to add any behavior or add any event listeners, I can find the right event that I want, and I use an on-click on whatever the event is attribute, and this sets up my element to listen to that event. I pass it a function to execute as this callback. In this case, it's my roll function. So let's see what errors we get. There's going to be a couple errors happening here. Let's work our way through them. Let's have a look at what just happened. So I'm going to try and click it, and let's have a look. Cannot read property set state of undefined. So it doesn't know what this is at the moment, and this is important. If we're using this as a callback, we have to write this in a slightly different way, where we actually use an arrow function. There's a reason for this. We're not going to go into it just yet. We'll do it in the Q&A, all right? After you've gone through and had a practice of this yourself, and then we'll have a look at why we need an arrow function for this. So you can see here, let me refresh the page. It starts off at 111. I click the button, and it changes to 234. So see it again. Click the button, changes to 234. So this has caused my state to update, and then it calls my render function again. we can have a look at this happening. Let's have a look at console log in render. So you can see my in render method actually fires twice, and React actually does it first to check if there are any errors, and then renders it. So there's always two invocations of that method. We don't really need to worry about that, but when I click it again, you can see it happens again. So whenever I click that role, it updates the state and then causes that render method to execute. The reason it shows up twice is because React behind the scenes checks first if it's okay to render, and then it renders properly. So you can always log using a console log to see the order and execution of when these different methods are firing. So the last part about this, or the second to last part about this, is to make sure they're random. I always forget how to produce random numbers in JavaScript. Random integers between 1 and 6, please. Fine, that looks possible. So what I want to do is I want to set state, but I don't want this array. I want a new array of random numbers. So I could do something like and then take whatever's in this .date dice and then map it through, and then it doesn't really care how many numbers it is. Return a, how many brackets do I have? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. That might work. I just want to return a random number, and then I will set it like this. That might work. I don't know. We'll see what the errors are. Right, cool. Get loads of random numbers and loads of random method and calls. Okay, so let's zoom back out to here. Our original intention was to find a way to create a component that could store state and update it. All right. And the second question was, how do you trigger behavior off the click event? So let's go back and see how we answered them. We thought about the question of does the state change? Yes, it does, because we're updating it. So we're using a class component. We're extending the React component, and we've set up our component to have some initial state. We're using the state object, which is what React expects for you to be able to use and update. And we're using a dice property and a value of 3 ones to begin with. That's essentially our initial state. We have our render method, which returns to us essentially, is the purpose of this is to describe what the user sees. And we have a button that has an on-click attribute value with a callback function. This role function is this one here. That's what we've described. And then we also show the dice. And the way that we've shown the dice is by looking at the dice property, state dice, and then we loop through it. And we take each of those numbers and we form an HTML element around it. So if we go back and inspect this page, you can see here that each of those elements are wrapped in an HTML element. In order to write JavaScript within that return statement, you have to use the curly brackets. Essentially, think of it like interpolation, right? It's a React way of saying you can use HTML, but also JavaScript within that return statement. For this role function, we'll talk more about why this has to be an arrow function after you've gone through and practiced it yourselves. And we have to make sure in order to update our state object, we have to call setState. So we call setState and we pass it an object, not an argument. It's an object of the property we want to change and the new value. All right. This is specifically the property you want to change and its new value. Cool. So this is a class component and helps us keep an updated state. Now, we can look at this dice down here and extract from this a component that just represents one of the die. Here we're still using HTML, a span element that represents a die. We could extract this, and then the question becomes, well, does it need to keep any state? Yes. Does it change? No. So here we could just use properties to hold the value of that number. So let's have a look at how we can quickly extract a functional component as opposed to our class component. So what I want to do is replace this line. I'm going to keep it like that for the moment so we can have a look at it. Rather than create that HTML element, I want that to be the responsibility of a separate component. And all my dice needs to care about is that it asks, thinking about back to modularity and keeping things small. I'm going to create a die property, a die component, and pass in this number. I guess it's a little bit confusing, so I named it die, but fine. Let's give it a value and keep it something like this. So die comes from this. I'm using a property called value. So let's see how this would work. If I'm using the die name as a component, I need to make sure I import it. Import die from, I guess I'll put it in the same directory. So let's create die.js. What a lovely name for a file. So let me put it on the right so I can see it at the same time. Let's import React from React. This doesn't need to be a class because it just holds properties. Let's remember to export before I forget. And here we can write our functional component in a couple different ways. What's the simplest way to do this? Let's give it a name called die, and then let's write an arrow function for this. Let us pass in props. So this is important. We're passing in properties, and the property that we gave it was value. So I know that I want to write my span element. This is where I'm putting it now, rather than here. And inside of my span element, I want somehow to get at this value property. So because I pass in as an argument props, I have access to anything through props. And I will do something like props like this, props value, because I'm using, I can change this to be, I don't know, die value like this. And if that's the property name that I want, I would have to change it here. because it's return like this, I think I need the curly brackets here. Okay. So this is a functional a component. It's just one function that takes in props as its argument. I've named it die. It's an arrow function. This is the arguments. This is the return value. We have to make sure we import React because this is not real JavaScript. So we have to make sure this is able to be read by React. I'm returning from this function a span element that holds in it the properties, but specifically the die value property. So this has to make sure it gets passed in on this end here. Okay, so let's have a look at whether we implement this correctly or what is going on. We, for some reason, have a couple of forward slashes. That's clearly an error, so not just an error, just a bug somewhere. So I'll go remove that in a second. But we managed to extract that that sort of logic of that represents the die and move it to this functional component. So if ever I want to change how my die looks like, I don't need to worry about my dice roll component. I just go to my die component. And where are those two? Is it that? Yes, it is that. What else was I going to talk about? No, I think this is it. Okay, let me pause there for thoughts and questions over what I've done. What was interesting, what stood out to you, what was confusing. And know that there'll be some things that clearly are new that I want you all to practice over the next 45 minutes, and then we'll come back as a Q&A. But what thoughts and questions do you have?
The state being stored as an object, I mean, obviously it doesn't look like it needs to because we've only got one thing. I can see how it would be more useful if you had more than one, but does it need to be an object?
Yes.
Okay.
More thoughts and questions?
Yeah, Ed, would you only ever have that one this.state property?
The state property, yes, you only need one. So
yeah, you wouldn't have this.state as this, and then this.die is this, and this. You'd only have the one this.state.
Correct.
And so this.setState always refers to that one.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you ever want more initial state, you would just add more properties here. Why you would have something called cup, I don't know. Yes.
I know props is like to do with the component you're extending, but could you go over what that is again? Because I forgot what you said earlier.
There are two ways to think about state at the moment using components. One is state that's going to change or be updated, and one that's not. So on the right-hand side, you see a case where my value of my die isn't going to change, right? Once I've randomized it. This won't change. So I don't need to worry about keeping it as state or calling set state. I just want a function that takes in that number and just displays it. So I pass in the value of that die using properties. It's a property. And the property by name of die value, and I pass it in here. So that's essentially what props allow you to do. Props short for properties. It just allows you to set initial property values. So a component can have any number of initial property values, and you pass them in here in sort of key value pairs. If they need to change, however, we need to change it to using a state object. And so that means writing a class component. At the moment, there's a different way we can use React later, but for the moment, we've got to think about a class component being a stateful component and a functional component being a stateless component. All right. So up here on the top on the left, if I did want to use my class component with some initial properties, in addition to state that changes, I could do that. So let's have a look at that example. Maybe, for example, in my dice roll, I want to start off my sort of component with something like every time my dice roll component starts, it's going to have use initial dice. It's a different place to put that initial dice as because this is props. In order to have that happen, rather than hard code it here, I take it from my props initial dice. Is that what I said? Initial dice. So the class component can also have props, all right? It's just this doesn't change. I don't need to change the initial dice. It just happens once, and then I randomize it from that point on. Good questions. More questions.
Does that mean before you added, you took the die out of the class, that you could have omitted the props or not?
It's always good practice, even if you don't use them, just to keep it there, because the super will set up the component as well for other things.
Sorry, I'm struggling to understand the reason for the function of die on the right. So, because obviously before you just had it inside the map at the bottom. So, can you just give an example of what you could put in the die.js file, like to extend it a bit? You see what I mean?
So think about separation of, or better yet, modularity. My dice roll shouldn't have information about what my die looks like. That's the responsibility of this component to figure out what my die looks like. Yeah. So dice roll just tells die to then render itself. So we're trying to decouple these components, or rather decouple the logic of these components. Yeah.
But doesn't this dot state tell you what the dice looks like?
No, it just tells me the value, not what it looks like. I can use different kind of HTML elements. I can have a bunch more styling, a bunch of things. It's to help people who read your code to know if I need to change what my die looks like, I go to this component. If I need to change the behavior of the randomizing, I go to this component.
So when you say looks like, you mean in your browser?
Yeah. So the same kinds of concepts we've been thinking about so far in object-oriented design, we can also use here. They're quite fundamental ideas of modularity. What logic needs to exist in different places. It's entirely reasonable to keep all in one here. There's not much that actually has to happen here. I'm giving you an example of why, or these two different kinds of components and why this might be a good idea. All right. At the moment, there's a trade-off. There's not a lot happening, but where possible, it's trying to separate out that. We go back to here. We can model this as essentially. Let me get this back online. We zoom in here. This is like a parent component, and these are essentially child components. You know, you could also say this is, no, we won't do that. All right, so you can have like, this is like the parent, and these are the different children of that component. So the parent component asks the children components to render. And there usually is some kind of relationship where the higher you go, the more state they need to have. So usually you have a stateful component at the top and then more functional components below. Because these don't need to do anything. They just simply show up. Okay. Keep thinking about questions if you have any. What I want you all to do is do something similar to this. It will, it might cause you to think a little bit more, but the same kinds of things are happening here, all right? I want to have 3 buttons called red, blue, and yellow. I want to have a heading, I am a chameleon. I want to click on any of the buttons and for the heading text color to change that stated color. All right, so if we diagram that quickly, where is my thingamajig? And have a look at those requirements. 3 buttons called red, blue, and yellow. Red, blue, and yellow. It's a bit weird seeing it all in purple, but fine. I want to have a heading, I am a chameleon. And if you click on one of the buttons, so simulator click here, if you click on the red, then that causes this text to change color. All right. So I want you to think about the kinds of components that you need. One way to do this is to have this as to keep everything in one component for the moment and get it to work. All right. So like step 1 is to just use one component. All right. Practice using that class component with state that changes. The thing that changes is going to be this part here. All right. So you need to figure out how to keep everything in one component for the moment, and then you can think about extracting a functional component. So you click on one of these buttons and you cause this text color to change. And you'll likely be having to do something with CSS, change a CSS property to make that color change happen. Change CSS property, keep it as simple as you can, don't over-engineer it, and this is your task for this morning. No test needed, and start off with one class component and then think about what you can extract. Any questions before you get started? Cool. I will share snippets of my code so you have access to that as a reference. Otherwise, let's have a good 45 minutes until about 11:15. Any questions, we'll go through them then, all right? Makes sense? Does everyone know what they're going to start doing? Cool. Cool. Awesome. See you in 45 minutes.